Sgt. Pepper is spinning on every turntable across the Western world. And the summer of 1967 belonged to the Beatles in a way 1966 didn't quite. The four men inside that iconic album cover are pacing around a very gilded cage because they symbolically burned their Moptops on the front of their own record. They surrounded themselves with cardboard cutouts of their former selves, which leaves one massive question about what comes next. Killed the thing you used to be while the entire world watches and waits for this new version to emerge. The real problem is they don't actually know what that version is yet. It isn't cute and it isn't zany, and it definitely isn't those lovable lads from Liverpool that winked at the Queen. They want something dangerous that might actually scare the parents who just bought their kids a copy of Sgt. Pepper. And somehow the answer lands on a working class playwright from Leicester named Joe Orton, a man whose entire body of work reads like Oscar Wilde armed with a flick knife. Now, why would the biggest band on the planet hand their film career to a guy who just wrote a play about hiding stolen money in a coffin? Now, the answer tells you everything about what the Beatles were actually running from. Now, by the time they stopped touring in August of 1966, the Beatles had essentially become studio hermits. Now, people love the word hermit because it implies a kind of monkish withdrawal, but that doesn't really fit with what was happening. They were explorers inside the four walls of Abbey Road, pushing tape loops forwards and backwards, and pulling orchestras into free-fall crescendos, or writing songs and keys in different structures. The public didn't know it yet, because to the most of the world, they were still four grinning faces from a hard day's night. They were lovable, palatable, but above all, they were safe. The problem gets laid bare in late 1967, when Magical Mystery Tour airs on BBC television, and the critics absolutely obliterated it. Now, the public were really baffled by it, because Paul's idea was just to chuck everyone on a bus and then film it and see what happens. It was supposed to be an improvised psychedelic road trip with no script and no director, but the result was a total failure. So for a band that spent 2 years refining what pop records could be, their foray into film and looked amateur and really messy. The takeaway was brutal, but it was clear. It proved you can't just wing it anymore. Cinema requires a different kind of discipline than the studio experiments that they've been running. They realised they needed someone who understood the structure, the tension and release, and to build a world around the four of them. Paul McCartney becomes the prime engine behind this push, and he starts reading and watching everything to find a writer who won't hand him another Dick Lester romp, like Hard Day's Night. He doesn't want any more chase scenes or cheeky one-liners, because the music they're making modulated into much darker territory. A Day in the Life isn't cheeky, and Strawberry Fields Forever isn't a romp, yet their film persona was frozen in 1964. Every day it stays frozen, the gap between the art they were making and the way they are perceived keeps widening. That gap is the central tension of their entire post-touring existence, because they wanted to be seen as artists instead of just products. A film is the only logical next step if they wanted to complete this transformation, but it had to be as radical as the music itself. They needed a total break from the cute narrative, and nothing else will do. So Joe Orton was born in Leicester to a working class family, and he spent his early years failing as an actor before he eventually served 6 months in prison. His crime? Defacing library books with his partner Kenneth Halliwell. But that said, his time behind bars is where his voice really started to emerge. This channel needs your help. It turns out 93% of you wonderful people that watch this channel don't subscribe. Now, we need your subscription to tell YouTube that this channel is worth looking at and pushing. That way it will generate more opportunities, which means we can get more content out for you, which is something we absolutely love doing. It's just a click, it's absolutely free, and it would mean the world to us. Thank you so much. So by the middle of the 60s, he'd already written Entertaining Mr. Sloane and Loot, which were two plays that take the machinery of polite British farce and load it with something lethal. The dialogue he wrote was elegant and precise and almost like a series of polished poems, but the actual content was filthy and anarchic. He was suspicious of every authority figure he could find, so he cast priests and policemen and parents as ridiculous characters in a comic strip that was rapidly catching fire. His signature was always the collision of surface calm and buried chaos, and he used well-mannered sentences to deliver subversive ideas right past your defences. So Paul McCartney read Loot and something just clicked for him, because he'd found the writer who understood the exact trick the Beatles had been pulling since Revolver. You use familiar form that people trust already, then inject it with content that just pulls the rug out from underneath them. But they're really not. Just like the Beatles songs still sounded like pop, even though the lyrics got really strange. McCartney saw a kindred spirit in Orton and recognised him as someone who knew how to smuggle chaos into the mainstream without setting off the alarms too early. The two sides eventually arranged a meeting, and that's where the story gets really interesting. Orton wasn't dazzled by him at all. He wasn't a fan in the way most people were fans of the Beatles in 1967. His diaries reveal a man who was unamused by the circus of their fame and totally unintimidated. He just treated them like regular guys without any of the yes-men energy that normally surrounded him. And for four men, he was constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from him. This was rare oxygen. They loved him immediately, and diaries show a genuine liking between them that went beyond professional courtesy. He found the band funny and sharp and decided they were well worth the trouble of a collaboration. So the band gave him something pretty loose, asking him to write something for the four of them plus one female character. A bit like Help, really. Orton interpreted the woman character in a way that nobody in the Beatles camp would ever anticipate, because he saw gender as just another convention waiting to be detonated. So he went away to work on it, and what he delivered in early 1967 wasn't just a script that pushed the boundaries of what a pop star could do. It seemed to be a script that had never heard of boundaries in the first place. When the script finally arrived, the title page read Up Against It. And within the first few pages, it was obvious that Orton didn't just ignore the guardrails. He seemed to find the idea of rules actively amusing. And the plot he built was a convoluted farce about a political assassination, cross-dressing, and a woman named Mrs. Drumgoole who might actually be a man. The Beatles weren't written as a unified gang of four lads having an adventure together. Instead, Orton completely fractured the group dynamic. John was cast as a bumbling conspirator named Jack Ramsay, who was tangled in a plot to kill the Prime Minister, while Paul was a sexual schemer named Ian McTurk, who spent his time manoeuvring through bedrooms. George was set to play a vicar. That would have been amazing. And Ringo was the one man who couldn't figure out how the whole farce had swallowed him whole, which, to be fair, seems right for his on-screen persona. But it wasn't just the plotting that felt radioactive to the studio, but the dialogue itself, which had explicit sexual banter running through the whole thing like a live wire. Characters celebrated bisexuality openly and casually. And it's almost as if anyone objecting to it had never crossed Orton's mind when he was writing it. So authority figures like police inspectors and clergymen were reduced to pompous idiots. The whole thing reads like Orton looked at the polite machinery of the Beatles film and decided to strip every gear and pour acid on the chassis just to see if the car would still run. But the script actually worked, because it was doing exactly what Sgt. Pepper was doing musically at the time. You take the familiar form like a music number or a string section, and you inject the surreal, dangerous content until the frame starts cracking under the pressure. Orton's script was the equivalent of A Day in a Life. You use the same trick in a different medium, and that's exactly why McCartney wanted him for this project. He recognised the modulation in Orton's writing before anyone else in the room understood what kind of key change was coming for the culture. Now, the script landed in front of the Beatles in early 1967. And the response? Well, it was exactly what you'd expect from four men who just publicly executed themselves from their former Moptop selves. There was genuine excitement at the audacity of the writing at first. But then the fear started to creep in, because it wasn't just edgy. Edgy is something you can package and sell to papers as artistic growth. But this script looked like career suicide if it was handled the wrong way. Also, they knew they didn't have Brian Epstein's full confidence on this one, because Epstein was curious by nature and protective of the brand that sat on top of the world. The question of whether to move forward hung unanswered until the spring of 1967 rolled into the summer, leaving the band to decide if they should commit to this new strange versions of themselves or retreat to the familiar. In August of 1967, Brian Epstein was found dead in his London home from an accidental overdose. And the man who had held the group together since the Cavern days was suddenly gone. Without their managerial anchor to steer the ship, the four of them were left to manage themselves, leaving no single voice to make a final decision. John felt really drawn to the danger of Orton's script. But while Paul understood the vision, he was really worried about the massive risk they were taking. And George and Ringo, well, they just remained curious about the whole thing. And because nobody could really make a decision, the conversations about it just stalled as the weeks went by. But also that same month, a second death turned the script from a difficult project to a literal ghost, when Joe Orton was murdered by his partner, Kenneth Halliwell. In their London flat, Halliwell bludgeoned him to death with 9 hammer blows before taking his own life with an overdose of barbiturates. The man who wrote the script intending to liberate the Beatles from their own squeaky clean image was dead at only 34 years old. And Up Against It became an artifact almost overnight. Because the tragedy attached felt too real, it felt too heavy for the psychedelic fantasy of the summer of love and all that nonsense. So the band, they just went into retreat, and instead they put out Magical Mystery Tour on the television, only to watch it get savaged by critics. Eventually they released Yellow Submarine. Why'd you push that button, Ringo? Which was weird and charming, but it was an animated film that kept him in a safe world where they didn't have to inhibit characters that might destroy the brand. That subversive moment had just passed them by, and the group never made a live-action film together again. So Orton's script still sits there unproduced and occasionally shows up as a stage curiosity. But it lingers as proof that they were actually willing to torch the whole thing. This lost film is a lot more than just a footnote in a trivia book, because it represents the exact moment the Beatles nearly jumped from pop stars to full counterculture icons. The fact they didn't actually make the leap tells you just as much about the band as the music they eventually released. Orton's script acted like a mirror, and if they'd just had the nerve to look into it, they might have seen their own futures staring back at them. Thanks so much for joining me into this deep dive into the Beatles Lost movie. What's your favourite Beatles movie? I'd love to know that. Mine's Help. I love Help. I've watched it so many times I can't even count. Let me know what your favourite movie is. What's your favourite Beatles song? What's your favourite Beatles album? If you'd like any more stories on this nature, let me know in the comments as well. Now, the big important thing, I hate to beg you, but if you could like and subscribe, you'd massively help me out. I'm trying to get the channel out there and get more of these stories out for you. I'm going to take deep dives into songs soon and pick a song and have a deep dive into that as well. Anyway, I've been Woody. Thank you so much for joining me on this. It's been an absolute blast learning about this. Let me know what your favourite Beatles film is in the comments. And you take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Love and peace.